That opening video mix, or collage of sorts, shows you just some of the violence that went down in Toronto on Wednesday, November 5th. A campus group, Students Supporting Israel, had organized an event at which an IDF reserve soldier named Jonathan Karten was to come to talk about the war in Gaza. It was a small gathering where students could listen, engage, and ask questions without fear. At least, that was the plan. Aside from being legally, ethically, and factually incorrect in her very bold indictment of Israel for having committed genocide in the Gaza Strip, Mayor Chow, in this moment, and so many others, very overtly and deliberately stokes the toxic Jew hatred that has become entrenched and normalized in Toronto. But this is about so much more than an anti-Semitic mayor. It is about a police chief, Myron Demkiw, who panders to extremists. It is about provincial and federal political leadership that looks away or tacitly approves of and agrees with the Jew haters. We don't know. It is about a Canada that is profoundly changed from what it was a decade ago, 2 years ago even. In this podcast, I will be focusing on what has transpired in the last few weeks, but in particular, the extreme situation on Elm Street involving Jonathan Karten and others. What really happened in a nondescript commercial building where the MTU students met on November 5th. I've spoken with dozens of people since November 5th, some who attended the event, some who live in Toronto and work in law enforcement, media, and regular people who just live there, Jews and non-Jews. This hostility directed at Jews in Toronto and Canada is not really about a ceasefire in Gaza or Palestine. It is about Western liberal democracies being overtaken by violent extremists. As we've seen throughout history, the Jews were just first, easy targets. Others tell themselves, this has nothing to do with me. This is between them. Until it does have something to do with everyone else. In this episode, part 1 of a 2-part series on anti-Semitism in Toronto and Canada, we feature an in-depth, in-person interview with Jonathan Karten, an exclusive, in fact. I sat down with Jonathan on Wednesday, November 12th in Tel Aviv. Everything that Jonathan Karten tells us is supported by video evidence and witness testimony from others who were present on the scene. The videos do not lie. Among the witnesses that State of Tel Aviv spoke with is Shoshana O'Flaherty. She was present at Elm Street on November 5th, and she spoke with us shortly after the event. Excerpts from her interview are included in part 1, as is in-depth reporting and analysis from others. Toronto is home to approximately 200,000 Jews and has turned, particularly in the last 2 years, since October 7th, from being a beautiful, tolerant city to a toxic cesspit that is dominated by constant Jew-hating and Israel-bashing protesters. Thanks to all of you for being here. And now to the main event, the interview in Tel Aviv with Jonathan Karten on Wednesday, November 12th, 2025, about the violent attack targeting Jewish students and speakers in Toronto that day. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Let's do this. Wednesday, November 15th. It's kind of mid-afternoon in Tel Aviv. Jonathan Karten, thank you so much for making time to speak to State of Tel Aviv today.
Thank you for taking the time. Seriously.
You were in Toronto last week, my hometown, and you had quite the experience there. So before we get into the details of what transpired, what do you do in life?
I work in venture capital, defense technology, specifically helping Israeli startups come to the American market and more practically liquidating later stage startups as well.
What brought you to Toronto?
So I was going around to various college campuses talking about my experience in Israel, my experience in the war, talking about my uncle who was kidnapped and murdered by Hamas, who's tortured to death and cut in two. And I was telling them the story from the horse's mouth, so to speak, trying to explain to them that it's not a genocide. We differentiate between combatants and civilians. I was there and I've seen it from my own hands. This is our policy. And I was trying to tell the truth.
You were serving as a reservist in the IDF for a period of time over the last 2 years.
October 7th, I get the call to return. I was in Argentina with a good friend of mine. I went from Argentina to Paris, Paris to Rome, Rome to Anapa, and then ultimately to the Haifa port in North Israel. I joined up with my team and continued to serve until really about a year ago when I was discharged from a longer period of reserves and joined up a larger venture capital firm here in Israel.
I know that you were invited by a student group that supports Israel on the campus of what is now called Metropolitan Toronto University. I think it's had a few name changes in the last few years. That event was held in Toronto last Wednesday, November 5th, and it became quite an event. Just take us through what happened. You get up that day, it's a Wednesday. What time was the event?
The event was called for roughly 1:30, 1:45. We had come about 30 minutes earlier to help prepare for the event. I understand that they also changed the event location twice because of security concerns and because the university didn't want it on their premises.
My understanding is that it's at a privately owned building on Elm Street, which is in downtown Toronto and very close to the MTU campus. So you approach this building. Did you notice anything unusual or out of
No,
sorts?
nothing out of the sorts. I walked through the building front door. I went up the stairs. This all happened in milliseconds.
Did they make any comments, noise?
It was as soon as I walked in, the altercation started. So there was no noise, no comments. Simply, it was an attack. It was an ambush. They knew where we were going to be before we got there.
So your reaction is immediate. It's good that you have military training. And you said to yourself, I've got to protect those students and others in the room where I'm about to give a talk. How many people were in that room, more or
I
less?
think roughly 10 or 11 people.
Okay. And men, women?
All women, with the exception of my friend Hanoch, and I think the guy who was there to take pictures. I couldn't let go of the door and tried to also take care of the other two students. Before I know it, I turned back, and he had pushed through the door with his body, with a drill bit in hand, knocked me in the face. I had a shiner here. And then I responded, and he turned around and started running. So I ran through the broken.
I see. And is that when the drill bit?
I believe that's when the drill bit pierced me. It could also have been the glass that had shattered from the door. It was all so fast. I didn't even know that I was bleeding. I wasn't thinking about it. And then I ran after the guy, trying to catch the assailant. And at that point, the shop owner comes out of his office, and I signaled to the shop owner, get him, or stop the door, something like that. I don't remember exactly what I said. And at that point, he had already run off. In my mind, it was better to stay because there was still roughly 5 other people in that main area. And I didn't think it was wise to chase after him and leave those 5 people in there with the remaining students.
So when you say there are 5 other people in that main area, you're talking about 5 additional masked people in the entry area?
In the entry area, right. Inside the shop.
And do we know if of these, the 2 and of the 5, are you able to tell whether they're men or women?
I can't tell, no. One of them seems smaller, but I don't want to assume their gender. You know.
So are they saying anything?
They're yelling death to the IDF. They're yelling arrest him, war criminal. There's a genocide. When I heard there's a genocide, I said, I was there. There's no genocide. And at that point, I started hearing more people also coming up through the stairs. I also tell as soon as the attack begins, I yell, call 911, call back up. And then they start yelling, chanting, all the remaining masked individuals. We asked them to leave. Other students, please ask them. They pleaded with them to leave. And then I heard more people coming out.
Okay, so the guy's taken off, your arm's cut, but you don't notice it. There's a lot going on. Okay, what happens next?
I contact the shop owner and I said, are they trespassing? Do you want them here? And he says, no, I don't want them here. And I said, I can remove them if you want. And he says, okay. And as soon as I got permission from the shop owner, I go back into the internal door.
These people caused the damage over here. They assaulted me and they broke our own property. So now I'm going to physically remove them from the premises. Everyone's fucking here.
We now continue with Jonathan's recounting.
I needed to barricade the door from additional people coming in. And then I called my friends to help bring furniture to barricade the door. The reason I did that was because I heard additional people coming in, and I couldn't barricade or stop the additional people from coming in, knowing that they might be a threat with masked protesters, terrorists already inside the room. So I had to make sure that I can barricade the door with no additional threats inside the room.
Obviously, this is not a friendly crowd.
No, of course not. They wanted to kill me.
Did they say that?
Yeah, death to the IDF. Arrest him, kill him, get him.
Did anyone, aside from the individual who broke the glass door and who seems to have directly caused your injury, did anyone engage in physical violence?
Not besides the individual that came at me, knocked my face, lacerated my left elbow, my right forearm, my right shin.
So now we have these 7 people in the hallway. The door is barricaded.
They're banging on the door. They're banging on the glass where the barricade is. They're banging and yelling and banging.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what are they saying? Same kinds of things?
Same kinds of things. Death to the IDF, get him, war criminal, arrest him, other death threats of that nature, we're going to get you, things like that. I don't pay too much attention to it because I wanted to basically understand if everyone inside the room was okay until the police get there.
You said that they were pro-Palestinian demonstrators. What caused you to believe that?
Well, they called me a genocideer. They said death to the IDF. They use a lot of tropes and mantras that pro-Palestinian groups use.
I want to just pause here for a moment and show on the screen everything that you've been describing to us so that people can actually see how frenzied and out of control it was. So let's roll that clip now.
Now block in. I need these over here.
There are many clips out on social media, but that one is the longest and provides the best overall sense as to how quickly things developed or devolved. I also spoke with Shoshana O'Flaherty, a Toronto woman who attended the event with Jonathan. In fact, she arrived at the venue with him and met the student representative from MTU outside on the street. The attack was terrifying, as Shoshana told me.
Jonathan acted very quickly after the 2 individuals were able to make it into our physical room. He closed the door and was holding the door closed. There was no lock on it. He turned around for 1 second because I was screaming. Things were getting really heated very quickly. And in that moment, he turned around. I looked over at the door, and the Hamas person who was completely covered in keffiyeh, his hood up, glasses, like they were all fully covered. We couldn't see anyone. He took out what I did not know at the time what it was, but he took a weapon out and he broke the glass. The glass came shattering down. That's when you hear me in the video scream. Jonathan barreled through that door to chase the 3 individuals, the individual who had the weapon, who broke the glass, and 2 others. So he goes through to try and catch them because when they broke the glass, they also lunged at him to stab him. And so he goes through the door. He had 3 very bad lacerations on his forearm. I'm not sure if it's from the glass. I'm not sure if the person was successful when he lunged to stab him, but there was blood everywhere. And then the three individuals, Jonathan couldn't catch them. They ran out. I called 911. 911 was not the most responsive. I think, though, they realized as things were escalating while I was on the phone, I was telling the girls in the room to hide under the table, to get to the back of the room and to hide. Jonathan, at a point, was able to remove everyone from our immediate space. He asked the permission of the owner. The poor man had no idea what was going on. You can see him in the footage saying, "I have nothing to do with this. Stop breaking everything. Please stop." So he asked his permission if he can remove them from the premises. Jonathan became very procedural. You saw his training, his military training very much come into action.
These people caused the damage over here. They assaulted me and they broke our own property. So now I'm going to physically remove them from the premises.
And then when it was very clear that our safety was very much at risk, he removed everyone. It's a miracle that he did, because at the time he did, about 40 more people showed up outside. And in the new footage that's been released online, you can see about 15, 20 cops showed up, and they were trying to break through the police barrier as well. Like, they weren't even relenting once the police got there. Like, they were desperate to get in and hurt us.
Shoshana was panicked, understandably, and terrified. You can hear her screaming in various clips we used throughout this episode. She also told me that the person who answered her 911 call did not seem to understand the gravity of the situation. She felt compelled to tell the first responder that this wasn't a typical protest, as she said to the operator.
"This is a very serious, dangerous situation. You need to get people here immediately. This is not a protest. This is a lynching. Like, this, you need to get here."
How are they prevented from entering the room?
Jonathan is standing there like a superhero, literally blocking them. It was a very chaotic scene. I mean, to be in an enclosed space like that with people screaming at the top of their lungs, it did not feel like your average protest. I mean, first of all, who brings a weapon unless they intend on using it? I was yelling at them, saying, "This is private property." You can hear me screaming, "Get out, get off our property. This is private property." But I mean, they were immovable. They were there for a purpose. Yeah, there was no de-escalating. Like, there was no opportunity to de-escalate, have a conversation. They were not relenting in any capacity. They were hitting the police officers. They were striking the police. They were trying to break through the police barricade. The police were shook. They were yelling at us. They were yelling at me for filming, telling me I was instigating and that I was causing problems by filming and agitating them.
That last comment by Shoshana O'Flaherty is important, that a police officer would tell her that she was instigating the mayhem by videoing the violence is not surprising, sadly. On many occasions, when the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas groups do their thing, Jewish people have been told, frequently in fact, that their mere presence is a provocation. I'm one of those people who, when present at a demonstration last March outside a downtown Toronto courthouse, I was told by a police officer to go stand in a small penned-in area where pro-Israel counter-demonstrators had been herded. You can see in this photo, taken on Armory Street in Toronto, looking west. On the left side of the photo, you see a large area reserved for loudspeakers, blaring anti-Semitic and anti-Israel slogans, ceaselessly. Straight ahead, the building with the unadorned, kind of dull facade, that's the U.S. Consulate building in Toronto, a favorite site for demonstrations by some. The plaza that the demonstrators have taken over for this particular event is right in front of the main courthouse at 361 University Avenue. And on the right side of the photo, you see a small patch of sidewalk reserved for Jews. That's where I was told to stand and refused to do so. There is a large police presence at this event. I spent over an hour there, observing, walking through the different groups. And one thing that I noticed consistently was how friendly the police officers were with the pro-Hamas side of the street, how politely they engaged with them. Heck, they were downright friendly, palling around, sharing laughs. Not so with the Jews. With the Jewish side, they were stern, decidedly unfriendly, curt. In fact, as they had been with me, they were plain rude. Tell me, why should I accept to be penned in to a small patch when I am doing nothing remotely illegal? Is it because I'm one of the few walking around unmasked? Is this really what law enforcement in Toronto and Canada considered to be keeping the peace? That's what they say they're doing. But I ask, why are they not enforcing the law? I was not masked. I was not carrying anything that identified me as being Jewish, pro-Israel, pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine. But the officer who confronted me, likely on the basis that I was not masked and was not sporting a keffiyeh, his presumption was that I was Jewish on the Israel team. And this is a regular practice by Toronto police that is bewildering. I've attended similar demonstrations in many cities, including Berlin. Those demonstrations are bigger, angrier, better organized, and the environment is very, very charged. Berlin police do what police officers are supposed to do. They enforce the law. Okay, so now we're returning to Toronto on November 5th, but I wanted to give you a sense as to how long-standing is this approach to law enforcement in these kinds of events in Toronto. Now, back to the main event, Jonathan Karten, and we pick up the story from the point that the police and reinforcements arrived at the Elm Street address on November 5th. Okay, so you're somehow keeping the barricade in place. They're outside yelling, calling for you to be killed, and all kinds of other slogans. And the police eventually arrive.
Police essentially arrive. They start taking people's statements, explain to them the scenario, the situation, which were the threats, where the threats came from. I told him that if he wants to find the attackers, my blood is probably on them. Because I noticed as I was removing one of the attackers that my forearm was against them and I was bleeding, it was gushing. So there must be some blood on their clothes still. That's how you can identify them. And he patches that through to the rest of his team. And then I then realize that they cannot control the situation, and I hear more people come in.
When you say more people, police officers?
More attackers, as I hear them yelling. And the yelling is not muffled, so which means they're already on the other side of the door downstairs. So I indicate to the police officer that there are more people coming inside. Go downstairs. And then I say, do you need help? Do you need help? They couldn't manage to close the door to the main building. So I went down. And I helped the two police officers that were downstairs trying to close the doors of the main building to ultimately close the door until more police officers came. I told them to call dispatch to bring more men. And eventually 10, 15 minutes later, more men came. But they were all standing around downstairs inside when the threat was outside. And so were the attackers. So I told them we need more men outside, not just inside. But they didn't seem interested in dispersing the crowd. I think they were just standing around inside. They didn't want to go outside again. I don't know why. I think maybe they were waiting for even more men to come before they would be willing to go outside. Because remember, there were 40 people outside. And I can't speak to why they did what they did.
Let's watch a clip of what Karten just described.
We need more men. We need more men.
So how does this kind of resolve? How does this end? disperse, or doesn't it? What happens?
So we waited for quite a while before it was dispersed. I think eventually the police officers had called more men, and they dispersed the protesters and attackers outside. And at that point, a paramedic managed to get in as well and was trying to help administer first aid. There was a woman by the name of Sam who was thrown to the ground, and she's knocked her head and went into epileptic shock. And she was sent to the hospital. And then I had to get to the ambulance. I asked for police to escort. But at that point, most of the police force had already left. So I went to the hospital and ended up at St. Michael's Hospital to get treatment in the emergency room. I was treated, given a tetanus shot.
Have you ever encountered a situation like this?
Never to the point of violence. I've encountered yelling, screaming, disruption. I've encountered threats, but never violence, never like this.
Not even on Columbia?
Not even at Columbia campus. At Columbia campus, a friend of mine was spit at, another friend of mine was shoved, but never wielding a weapon. It was always, I would say, violence in the spur of the moment, violence of passion, not premeditated. This seems like it was a premeditated attack.
And when you were interacting with the police from Toronto Police Force, is there anything that sort of struck you in terms of the police and how they came into the situation?
I think they were a bit shocked. They seemed a bit rattled, running from place to place, checking with one another. I think for the most part, they were trying to get a understanding of the scenario.
So, Jonathan, it's been a week. You've had an opportunity to reflect and relax and come back to real life. What has gone on, though, in the last week or so of note?
So it's been a media frenzy. A lot of texts of support and love. People telling me that they want to learn to start defending themselves. In general, I think a real change in the hearts of Canadian Jewish citizens who feel like it's given the time to start making a change.
I could not agree more with Karten's diagnosis and recommendation. A longtime resident of Toronto, I am. It has been heartbreaking to witness its descent into chronic violence targeting Jewish residents in particular. As we know too well, it begins with a tolerance for hateful speech and conduct. Since October 7th, when I happened to be visiting in Toronto, the city has been a cesspool of open hostility and hatred directed at Jews and all things Israeli. It began with street celebrations on October 7th as the Hamas slaughter was ongoing. And the pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine conduct, effectively sanctioned and blessed by all levels of political leadership, from the chief of police up to the office of the Prime Minister of Canada, has continued unimpeded. Public officials followed the early example of then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who constantly explained that the pro-Hamas and progressives who had overtaken our city were peaceful protesters exercising constitutional rights. But that was, and is, nonsense. There is nothing peaceful about calling for the annihilation of Israel and murder of Jews, nor are there any provisions of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, our constitutional document, that protect such conduct. But this wildly irresponsible position was quickly adopted by virtually all police forces, mayors, provincial premiers, and federal authorities, with very few exceptions, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith being one. Not until a violent riot in Montreal in November 2024 received international attention did Prime Minister Trudeau criticize the anti-Jewish violence. Since NATO was in town and the coverage was wide, he could not ignore it. And things have only deteriorated under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who was elected on April 28th, 2025. The Canadian Jewish community is the fourth largest in the world after Israel the United States and France, but it is often overlooked. Jonathan Karten's encounter drew much-needed attention to what is going on in Canada and Toronto, where most Canadian Jews reside. Early next week, we'll bring you part 2 of this special series about the November 5th attack and so much more. We hear more from Jonathan Karten, additional experts who have been watching the surge of anti-Semitism in Toronto closely, and we take a hard look at the way in which Toronto police manage the very direct, violent, sustained, and escalating threats to Jews in Toronto. Of approximately 360,000 Jewish Canadians, 200,000 live in the Greater Toronto Area, one of the largest communities in North America. Even in the aftermath of the shock of the November 5th attack, violence and incitement continue, as does questionable policing. In part 2 of this series, we will continue with Jonathan Karten's telling of what transpired. The arrests of 6 individuals in connection with the violence, and ongoing and intensifying open hostility, incitement to hate, targeting Toronto's Jewish community. We'll also take a hard look at the conduct of Toronto police. They seem to very freely support the pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine contingent while treating Jewish Torontonians, well, as if they're the ones inciting hatred and fomenting violence. The inversion of morality and appropriate response is very plain, ongoing, and consistent. This will not just go away. If anything, it will continue to get worse and worse. I would also like to express profound gratitude to Andrea Marcus of Toronto, who has very generously sponsored part 1 and part 2 of this special podcast. If you'd like to discuss sponsorship opportunities, you know where to find me, Vivian@stateoftelaviv.com. So, until we drop part 2 of this podcast, thanks so much for being here. Stay safe. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Szabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here.